Thank you for watching the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe. This tank chat is going to be about this vehicle, the Panzer 61, a Swiss tank from the Cold War period. Now, Switzerland, although it's got that reputation of neutrality, it was neutral in the First World War and the Second World War, although combatants on both sides would have questioned that neutrality at times, it always had an interest in tanks. Right after the First World War, it buys some Renault tanks off the French, some Renault FT tanks, and in the 20s it buys some Cardin Lloyd carriers. In the 30s it builds under license the Czech TNH tank, and after the Second World War it goes to Czechoslovakia and buys what the Swiss will call a Panzer Jaeger G13, which for many of you, you'll know as the Hetzer. They carried on making them in Czechoslovakia after the war. So about 158 of those go into service. And they were actually in service with the Swiss military from just after World War II, right up into the early 1970s. Now, the Swiss are looking at the world situation post-World War II. They have managed to keep their independence during the Second World War, but they see the threat, the future threat that they see coming their way is actually Soviet Russia. So again, even though they're not part of NATO, they are looking at their military, how might they defend their homeland as best as possible. And we all know, or many of you probably pick up, you know, they have a citizen army, people take their guns home with them at weekends, etc. They have a large army that way, but they also have quite a considerable arms industry, because there's a number of quite famous manufacturers that are actually based in Switzerland. But up to this point in their history, they've only ever built tanks under license, but not actually, they've never created an indigenous one. And when the Swiss in this post-World War II world, they're looking at, we think we need more tanks for our military, they are in the same position. Again, if you saw our tank chat on the S-tank, they're in the same position really as the Swedes, that they want to buy tanks, and the tank that everyone seems to want to buy in the early 1950s is the British Centurion, but because of the Korean War going on, they are not available for sale at that particular moment in time. So just like Sweden, Switzerland, the General Staff, 1951, they say, right, we need to do a project to look if we can build and design an indigenous tank for our own military forces that way. Now, meanwhile, they buy some AMX-13 tanks from the French. They end up with about 200 of those to almost, not quite as a stopgap, but that keeps them going whilst they start this project, which ultimately ends up with Panzer 61. They go to the State Arsenals at Thun, and they start a design process that leads to a kind of mock-up vehicle in about 1955. The actual first prototype vehicle runs in 1958. And that first vehicle that runs has got a 90mm gun on it that's actually made in Switzerland. The second model that comes out the following year, they put the British 20-pounder gun on as a model. And then the third model, which really becomes what is the prototype, proper prototype for the PZ61, has the British L7 105mm gun put on it. Now, they build 10 of these pre-production vehicles. They call them PZ58 because that's when the first one came out. And they test those before, in 1961, the Swedish government gives confirmation, yes, you can go ahead and build 150 of these PZ61 vehicles. And they're basically built and they enter service in the mid-1960s. Now, meanwhile, in the background, by the way, they have been able to buy, and they ultimately buy about 200 Centurion tanks. So that's going on as well. So the Swiss Army is going to have a number of different armoured vehicles in service at the same time. So what do you get for a PZ61? Well, if you look at this is our PZ61 here. From the point of view of what they've designed, they've gone for a cast hull and a cast turret. That's done by the Fischer company in Switzerland. And it ultimately means you've got about 120mm of armour protection at the front and 120mm on the front of the turret as well. So quite good protection levels. In that turret, you've got 3 men. The 4th man, the crew member, is a driver at the front, and that's all based around, of course, this 105mm L7 gun. Now, it's built under license in Switzerland, and the Swiss use slightly different ranges of ammunition than some of the other people do. But because the L7 and the 105mm is in service in so many different countries, there's quite a range of ammunition available. So the Swiss buy some Israeli ammunition at certain points. They make their own particular type of Hesh round as well for this gun. It is aimed by the gunner who's actually got a periscopic sight. He doesn't have a direct line sight in front there. And you can also see on the sides of the turret, there is a rangefinder that is actually operated by the commander of the vehicle once he's inside there. It would take about 56 rounds of this 105 ammunition stowed inside the vehicle. And on the other side from the commander is the loader. His hatch, if you look, they've both got sort of like mini cupolas. His is slightly higher and it's got a bracket mounting on it so they can fit the Swiss MG51 7.5mm machine gun. The MG51 is basically a copy of the German MG42, but with a different caliber, 7.5 in Swiss military forces, all their small arms ammunition. Now, the first models of the PZ68, they start with a 20mm secondary armament that's put right next to the 105 gun. That is fairly soon done away with, and they replace that with another machine gun, so that another 7.5 machine gun goes in there instead as well. Now, on the sides of the turret, there's 3 banks of smoke dischargers on either side, and there's actually a turret basket at the back. There's no bustle as such, there's no extension there, just a basket for stowage. Now, as you work down, driver in the front, you can see he's got a periscopic way of looking out. He's got an escape hatch underneath him, and the hatch actually opens backwards, but you can't open it fully when you actually have the gun over the front. So quite often in photographs, you'll see the gun at about 10 o'clock rather than directly over 12 o'clock, and that's so the driver can have his hatch open for driving around most of the time. There is actually a barrel lock on the rear of the tank as well to secure the 105 gun if they're going on long route marches or drives, etc. Now, the engine in the back, it's a fairly traditional setup. You've got a firewall, you've got the fighting compartment, then the driver at the front. The engine they use is a one big imported thing. They actually take an MTU engine in from Germany, and it's got about 650 horsepower. The engine pack, or power pack as they call it, you could swap one of those in about an hour. But it gives the vehicle a top speed of about 30 miles an hour, and it's got a range of about 160 miles as well. So, you know, a very reliable power pack goes in the back of this vehicle. And it's part as well, one of the distinctive features of this vehicle is not just that lovely casting shapes you can see on it, but it's got a very definitely angled rear engine deck at the back there. Now, drive to the rear, the sprockets there, the tracks, you've got 6 double road wheels either side, manganese steel tracks, and later when they produce another version of this vehicle they call the PZ68, you can tell the difference between the two of them because these don't, the early ones, PZ61 doesn't have track pads on them, the PZ68 ends up slightly wider track with track pads on. And I mention the PZ68 because again, in Switzerland, they're looking at the development of this vehicle, and ultimately a new model is approved that they're going to build 170 of, as opposed to 150 of these earlier PZ61s. And that vehicle, some of these are rebuilt to meet the new standard. That new vehicle, it's got improved gunnery because it's got a stabilization system. That's a real big advantage there. Slightly more powerful engine. From the outside, they look very, very similar. Actually, it's quite hard to tell them apart. In fact, actually, I got a sort of snotogram from a Swiss Army officer one time saying we'd mislabeled our PZ68, as he was calling it, and I thought, all ready to apologise, went and did my homework and realised, no, actually, ours is a PZ61. Went back to the Swiss Army officer, explained that, and he went, oh yeah, you're right, sorry. So even the people serving in these vehicles can get them muddled up slightly sometimes. So as a vehicle that way, its design is, I was always told it was a lot smaller, narrower to go up Swiss mountain roads. Now it's only a foot smaller, or the width-wise, it's only a foot narrower than a Centurion. So that's a bit of a hard argument to really argue, but it definitely has very sensitive steering. And again, that idea, if you're driving something like a 36-ton tank around a mountain road, you do not want to be just having a bit of drift here and there. So they really are sensitive on the steering. And I think I've mentioned before, where we've been talking about our Tiger tanks, quite often the person who's going to learn how to drive the Tiger learns on this vehicle first, because it's actually got a very similar and sensitive steering system, similar to the Tiger from World War II. Overall, from the Swiss Army's point of view, never fires its gun in anger. They make a couple of variants from it later on, but it's not one of those vehicles that ends up finding a sales market. I'm not even sure if the Swiss were trying to sell it abroad at any time. But from our point of view, we're very grateful, because the Swiss government's very generous with its kit when it comes out of service, and there's a number of these PZ61s in private collections and museums around the world now, because they tend to not necessarily destroy their material. They do upgrades, they do other builds. There was a bridge layer on this, but very generously, if they go into store, they're happy to pass one on to the relevant and the right sort of museum. So overall, another interesting one of those vehicles that doesn't neatly fit within the usual east-west sort of mix of vehicles, but it's done in the Cold War, and it shows again another country trying to come up with an indigenous design and indigenous production. Let's do it ourselves. The Swiss don't continue with that, because ultimately, when this starts going out of service in the mid-1990s, and like many countries as well that's had the Centurion in service, they decide to replace those with the Leopard family, and they actually build Leopard tanks under license in Switzerland. They don't go on with an own indigenous design. But again, they do, because again, KW at Thun, they end up having, for example, MOWAG, a number of other companies still build armoured vehicles in Switzerland, even if they don't build fairly large main battle tanks in that way at all. But we're grateful to have it. Another interesting vehicle for our collection.
We have a fantastic selection of books, models, clothes and other gifts on the Tank Museum online shop. Everything to please people who are new to the subject up to the most avid tank enthusiast. When you buy from our online shop, you are supporting the Tank Museum charity, and that means we can carry on caring for our collection and producing this content. If you have supported us already, thank you very much, subscribe and do keep watching.